The Articles of Confederation were put together by a group of people who had not been an elected body. Their purpose was to establish some kind of law and order amongst the 13 states, and hopefully add legitimacy to this idea that there was going to be a new Republican government by the people, for the people in North America. This particular unit is going to take you through that early form of government, the Articles of Confederation. We're going to look at why it only lasted a short period of time. The bottom line is it was very weak. We'll also look at certain decisions the Continental Congress made under the Articles of Confederation that were valuable in structuring a constitution that would be lasting, and also establishing a uniform set of rights and policies for this new developing system of government. The members of the Second Continental Congress that drafted the Declaration of Independence were not elected officials, even though they wrote about creating governments that came from the consent of the governed. They had not been elected by the population at large. They were delegates, almost like ambassadors of their independent colonies, soon to be states. This is probably one of the most outstanding things about the founding era, is that because of the high ideals and the quality of leadership that the founding fathers possessed, we didn't turn into just another monarchy or dictatorship, but instead went from a system where these men were making decisions for everyone, even without their consent, towards a system of limited representative government. With the Declaration of Independence, all 13 states would be identified as independent countries. This was not about one United States of America, but a union of 13 independent states of America. Each one had the ability to coin money, raise armies and navies, make treaties and alliances, set up taxes, all the things that we think about a national government providing. Each and every one of these states was able and tried to do so. The Articles of Confederation were began to be drafted in 1776 and were adopted the following year. It would be another 4 years before that document was officially ratified and accepted by all 13 states. The real big issue with the Articles and why it took so long for them to pass had to deal with the selfish nature of each individual state. Once independence was declared with Britain, and each individual state responsible for its own defense and participation in the war, states engaged in sort of bold-face land grabs. As you recall, the Ohio River Valley, which had been prohibited under British law, was something that a lot of states wanted to get access to expand their own boundaries. The French and Indian Wars started with George Washington going out into the Ohio River Valley on behalf of Virginians. And when war breaks out, multiple states claim the same territory in the West. There were 6 states that had no holdings beyond the Alleghenies, and then there were 7 states, specifically New York and Virginia, that claimed huge acreages. And oftentimes these claims overlapped. The reason they wanted this territory, not only for expansion, but also for profit. One of the plans for how to pay for the war against Britain included the idea that after the war, each state would be able to sell a little bit of territory and use that revenue to pay for its war debts. Well, with multiple states claiming the same land, this created a system that was very insecure and wouldn't have worked effectively. as a strategy. So it created jealousies, it created hostilities between states, even as they're trying to work together in the common cause of independence. Here's the map, and outlined in red, you can see the disputed territory here: Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. That Ohio River Valley being lucrative for small farmers, being a place where the population could expand, but where states really wanted to make some money selling land, was the issue that held up the Article's ratification until 1781. Now, we need to examine the name Articles of Confederation. Our Constitution of the United States creates for one national government, and there is a responsibility for the different states, the 50 states that are a member of the one national government. But Confederation as a principle is a loose association of independent countries. The best modern example right now is the United Nations. We have multiple independent nations that participate in the United Nations. The reason we have one United States government today as opposed to 50 is because the experiences over the course of the Articles of Confederation's existence. Here are the chief problems. Number one, it depended on legislative rather than executive control. In fact, members of the Continental Congress so distrusted the idea of a central executive or top law enforcement official like the king had been, that they didn't include an executive branch at all. So all of the executive functions we think of today, enforcement of laws, military and defense, leadership on the economy, all of those things were left to each individual state to take care of. And that division and disorganization is going to cause a lot of problems. Furthermore, because each state wanted to keep its own identity and culture, there was no judicial branch at the national level. So whatever laws were passed, when they were passed by the Congress, were open for interpretation to the benefit of the state as opposed to the benefit of the nation. So you get multiple interpretations of one law depending on what state you're in. So with the embracing of republicanism, this notion that a government that represents the will of the people, the Articles of Confederation pretty much put all of its national level power in the hands of lawmakers. Okay, the notion that all men and all states are created equal is reflected in the fact that every state, regardless of population, regardless of how many people they had in that state, had only one vote. Okay, this is going to create a conflict between large and small states. If people are truly equal, then wouldn't it make sense that states with more people would have more say? But under the Articles of Confederation, it was a state vote as opposed to a vote based on population. And so it's going to be really antagonistic to large states, especially powerful states like Virginia and Massachusetts, that they have to kowtow to smaller states like New Jersey. I had mentioned earlier that in order to get anything done, consensus was key. The notion that we don't want one or a small group of individuals to dictate terms, and that we really need to protect the interests of the states, meant that under the Articles of Confederation, Congress required supermajorities in order to pass laws. And anytime that they discovered that their Constitution was failing and it needed to be amended, it required unanimous consent to amend the Articles of Confederation. In politics, it's almost universally unheard of to have unanimous consent. This meant that you're going to have a lawmaking body that's incredibly weak, that sees problems but can do nothing about those problems, and that depending on what state you're talking about, it's going to really be a survival of the fittest. And so while the states came together to fight the Revolutionary War for independence, they unified over that. They're not unifying over much else. Two of the major weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation include the inability to carry out any kind of national level policy that would benefit commerce. Furthermore, for the government to be able to stay afloat and collect taxes, as we've talked about, the whole idea that the best kind of government comes from the local level meant that the Americans during this time were hostile to the idea that a national government should put taxes on them. And so while Congress could ask for taxes, they couldn't enforce them. And so while Congress passes a 5% levy on imports, states virtually never pay it. At best, 25% of the states would pay their bills to the national level government on time. So it really became about leadership by persuasion as opposed to leadership by command. Congress could advise and advocate and appeal to the states for help and support and finance. However, they could not command it. And like I said, depending on self-interest, oftentimes their pleas went unheard. Compared to the Continental Congress before the Articles of Confederation, where we had a group of important citizens from the various states coming together to make decisions on their own for what they felt was the best interest of their states and of this movement that was taking place, the new Congress under the Articles of Confederation was much weaker. So we can see here, while that first Continental Congress really didn't have constitutional authority, they were more powerful because they were men of action. Under the Articles of Confederation, this Constitution that has been ratified and is legitimate, it's totally neutered the ability for America's lawmakers to do anything that is really especially meaningful. Yet there were a couple of landmark accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation. First of all, it was the first written constitution of a republic. This whole idea of the philosophies from the Enlightenment about republicanism had never really been put into play on a large scale level. So in that way, it was a big step towards our current Constitution. Furthermore, it did outline the general powers of the national government. And by what I mean by that is, if you intend to limit a government's power, one good way to do that is to create legal limits where the role of the government is defined in black and white on paper. It planted the seeds for union. It kept the ideal of the Declaration of Independence alive, that these United States are together. And lastly, the notion that what doesn't destroy you makes you stronger. The experiences under the Articles of Confederation weren't wasted. We now have a constitution that's one of the oldest in the history of the world. And it's because of the careful crafting to avoid the problems that had occurred under the Articles that we have an enduring constitution still today. Issue number 2 with the Articles of Confederation dealt with military and foreign relations. Relations with Britain remained really troubled. England had refused to send a minister to America even after the Treaty of Paris. It declined to negotiate any kind of commercial treaty. So even though the hot war was over, an economic war between England and North America continued. It closed the West Indies to trade to the United States. And most concerning, it maintained a chain of trading posts and military forts on U.S. soil, even though the Treaty of Paris had said that England would remove its presence from the new United States. Spain was also openly hostile to the new kid on the block. Even though the border of the United States now touched the Mississippi River, in 1784, Spain closed the river to American commerce, threatening the West with strangulation. So we do see the population of the United States slipping over the Appalachian Mountains, but it isn't going to push into the far western reaches of the new territory in present-day Arkansas, Missouri, and Illinois without a lot of interference from the Spanish and the British. While Americans will come over the Appalachian Mountains, they're not going to come down deep into the southern parts of the Ohio River Valley without interference from those two empires. France, America's friend during the Revolution, cooled off now that Britain had been humbled. They didn't consider the United States' absence of the West Indies to be an essential trade partner. In fact, they looked at the United States more as a debtor than as an ally. So the military support that France had given during the Revolution now was not as available. Americans also suffered on the high seas at the hands of bullies. The North African pirates from the Barbary coast ravaged Americans' Mediterranean commerce. The Mediterranean being the central hub of European shipping. The Barbary coast off of present-day Libya was notoriously run by pirate kings. America was a nation that was too weak to fight. It was too in debt to build its own army. So we, in a lot of ways, suffered under the oppression of empires where previously, as part of the British Empire, we had flourished. The third demonstration of the executive weakness of the Articles of Confederation is in economic leadership. Today, voters will tell you that one of the most important decisions or most important factors in deciding who to vote for as president is the economic policies of that particular executive. Without an executive branch, we had 13 different economies, 13 different strategies, and 13 different places all working for their own self-interest. Systems to raise tax money for the national level government, to fund the military, and to fund interstate commercial programs like building roads was absolutely ineffective because states refused to follow through with paying taxes. The one thing that continued was the national debt. Each state and the Continental Congress had massive amounts of debt. And states took the approach that they wanted to take care of their debt first. And so they weren't interested, not capable of paying national level taxes. The solutions that these debt-strapped states had then, with limited resources and no more credit, was to print paper money. During the colonial times, colonists were united under the British pound, which is a hard currency based on gold and silver. Without the gold and silver of the British Empire and with the debt of the American Revolution, colonies engaged in printing money and claiming its worth without it really being supported. It would be a lot like just printing monopoly money and claiming that this is how you're going to do your trade and this is how you're going to pay your bills. The more money that's printed, the less valuable it becomes. creditors put tremendous amount of pressure on farmers to pay their farm loans. Farmers who had served as veterans in the American Revolution and weren't being paid what they were promised under their contracts rebelled en masse. One of the most famous events demonstrating just how critical this financial issue was and how weak the military of the United States was after the American Revolution was Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, a farmer in Western Massachusetts, led a rebellion of several hundred men to the capital of Massachusetts to protest the foreclosure and the prosecution of indebted farmers who had not been able to pay their debts because they hadn't received payment from the Continental Congress for their service to the country. Well, the Continental Congress was unable to put together an effective response to Shays' Rebellion. Eventually, the Massachusetts militia was called up and was able to put down the insurrection. So ultimately, what we remember Shays' Rebellion for is demonstrating the economic desperation, the ineffectiveness of the national government to raise revenue, and the insecurity that the national level military was providing. Massachusetts eventually put forth debtor relief laws, and Shays' outburst created a lot of fear amongst propertied, established Americans. George Washington wrote of his concern about how poorly this reflected on the status of the new country, and that people were starting to call for a monarchy. People were starting to call for a stronger central government that could respond to these crises that were unaddressed in the disunity of the Articles of Confederation. So, in a sense, we go from a liberal movement for more Republican forms of government and independent autonomy for the states. And now the pendulum is swinging back the other way towards a conservative response that a stronger, more authoritarian central government that is stable and established and powerful would be the solution to the United States concerns. This drawing was done on the eve of the writing of the U.S. Constitution, and it features a farmer with a plow, a rake, and a bottle complaining, "Take all to pay the taxes." The discontent of the debt-rich and currency-poor farmers alarmed Republican leaders and helped persuade them that the Articles of Confederation needed to be replaced with a new constitution that provided for a stronger central government. The whole romantic vision of Thomas Jefferson was that the best form of lifestyle that one could possibly imagine was the enlightened yeoman farmer in a Republican government who was able to be independent and own property and yet participate in the decisions of making laws. That dream seemed to be fading away.